Welcome, dear listener, to another journey into the quiet corridors of history, where the echoes of lives long past still whisper in the walls. If you enjoy these immersive stories, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Write it in the comments below, and let's see just how far across the globe these stories travel. Now, settle in. Let the world outside fade away, and allow yourself to drift into the silk-draped chambers of another time and place. The first light of dawn slipped through the latticework of the harem windows, filtering into the still air with a softness that was almost deliberate, as if the sun itself knew to tread gently here. The scent of rosewater lingered from the previous night's rituals, mingling with the faint perfume of amber and the sharper tang of freshly burned incense. In this secluded world within the imperial palace, time seemed to move differently, unhurried yet deliberate, each moment shaped by centuries of tradition. The harem was more than a place of residence. It was a fortress of politics, culture, and subtle games of influence, hidden behind ornate walls that no man outside the sultan's inner circle would ever see. For a concubine, every morning began not with the ringing of bells or the barking of orders, but with a quiet choreography. The palace attendants, kalfas and ustas, the senior women responsible for order and discipline, moved through the marble corridors like shadows, carrying trays of warm water, scented oils, and delicate silken garments for the day. Before the first meal, there would be ablutions. Even in the most private moments, these acts were never entirely one's own. They were part of the constant performance of refinement that life in the harem demanded. In the low light of her chamber, the concubine sat before a tall bronze mirror, its surface polished to a dull gleam. The attendant combed her hair slowly, drawing the wooden comb from scalp to tip, each stroke a measured gesture. Hair was both ornament and message in the harem. The way it was oiled, braided, or left loose could reflect mood, intention, or even political alignment. Today, her hair was woven into a loose braid, threaded with a narrow ribbon of crimson silk, a subtle nod to vitality without the ostentation of gold. Breakfast arrived in small porcelain dishes, dates glazed with honey, a wedge of fresh cheese, figs split to reveal their pink interiors, and a steaming bowl of milky coffee. Coffee was both luxury and necessity here, a morning indulgence that sharpened the mind, a way to prepare for the day's encounters. No one in the harem was idle. Even pleasure in this place was work. The concubine knew that by mid-morning, she would be summoned to the central gardens where the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and the most powerful woman in the empire, often held informal gatherings. These were never mere social events. Beneath the laughter, the poetry recitations, and the exchange of embroidered gifts, alliances were forged and rivalries tested. To appear attentive yet discreet, confident yet deferential, this was the art. And it began with the smallest choices, even in how one greeted another woman in passing. The gardens themselves were a world apart, cypress trees casting narrow shadows over pathways of geometric tile, fountains trickling over carved stone basins, and pavilions draped in fine fabrics that swayed in the warm breeze from the Bosphorus. There, under the watchful eye of senior attendants, the women of the harem conversed in low voices, their words careful, their smiles measured. Some had been here for years, rising through the ranks from novice to favored companion. Others were newly arrived, still learning the unspoken rules that governed every glance and gesture. For the concubine, mid-morning also brought a different kind of duty: the cultural training that shaped the harem's reputation as a place of refinement. In a quiet hall, lined with shelves of manuscripts, she sat cross-legged on a silk cushion, as a tutor guided her through calligraphy exercises. Each letter of the Arabic script curved and tapered like a garden vine, requiring both precision and grace. Lessons in poetry, music, and dance would follow, for these were as essential to her role as beauty or charm. A concubine was not merely a companion to the Sultan. She was expected to embody the empire's highest ideals of artistry and intellect. By the time the noon meal was served, rice pilaf scented with saffron, lamb stewed with apricots, and bowls of yogurt flecked with mint. The sun stood high, bathing the harem's courtyards in a warm glow. The palace musicians played softly in the distance, their melodies weaving through the air like smoke. The concubine ate slowly, mindful of posture, aware that every movement could be observed and remembered. After all, the harem was as much a court of memory as of beauty. People here did not forget. The afternoon would bring a shift in rhythm. There might be a summons from the chief black eunuch, the gatekeeper to the sultan's private quarters, whose word carried the weight of imperial authority. Such summons were not always romantic in nature. Sometimes they were for service at an official banquet, or to accompany the sultan's favored wife in a ceremonial procession. But they were always significant, for visibility was currency here. The concubine, aware of this, maintained her composure. Even if her nam-e was not called today, she would be ready for tomorrow. As shadows lengthened, the harem settled into a quieter pulse. Women withdrew to their private rooms. Attendants prepared trays of sherbet and sweet pastries for the evening, and the sound of the muezzin's call to prayer drifted over the palace walls. For the concubine, evening meant another round of grooming, this time more elaborate. Kohl was applied around the eyes, fine powder dusted across the skin, and a fresh robe selected pale blue silk with embroidered cuffs, the fabric catching the lamplight in soft ripples. Whether or not the sultan saw her tonight, she would be prepared, for readiness itself was a form of power. As night deepened, the harem's great doors were locked from within, sealing the women inside their hidden world until morning. In her chamber, the concubine lay upon cushions, the sound of the Bosphorus faint beyond the walls, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air. Sleep came slowly here, for dreams were often crowded with both hope and caution. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same and yet never quite the same, in the quiet, deliberate dance of survival and influence that defined life in the Ottoman harem. The following hour unfolded with the slow, deliberate rhythm that only the palace could maintain, a rhythm meant to remind everyone inside that the world beyond the harem moved differently, faster, harsher, unpredictable, while here, every moment was contained, polished, controlled. The concubine, having completed her morning duties, moved through a corridor lined with intricate Iznik tiles, their deep cobalt and emerald patterns reflecting the soft light from above. The air was warm, scented faintly of sandalwood, and beneath it, the constant murmur of voices low, careful, always aware of the ears that might be listening. She entered a side chamber where the younger women, still in the early stages of their training, practiced the art of shadow dance movements that told stories without words. Every turn of the wrist and tilt of the head calculated to express emotion without breaking the boundary of propriety. This was not merely entertainment for the sultan. It was a language, one that could convey favor, longing, or loyalty to those trained to understand it. The concubine watched for a while, remembering her own early lessons, how each step felt like walking the edge of a blade. Too much boldness could be read as ambition dangerous if shown to the wrong person. Too much restraint, and one risked invisibility, a fate as final as exile. From there, she was summoned by a soft-spoken attendant to the private quarters of the Valide Sultan. The invitation alone was cause for careful thought. The Valide's presence was like a mirror in which every woman saw her own standing reflected. To arrive too quickly might seem eager, yet to delay could suggest disrespect. She chose a measured pace, pausing only to smooth the folds of her silk robe to ensure that her expression was serene but not vacant. Inside, the Valide's chamber was a study in quiet authority. Thick carpets muted every footstep, and the air was cooler here, the windows shaded by carved wooden screens. The Valide herself sat upon a low divan, her hair hidden beneath a fine white scarf embroidered with gold thread. Beside her was a tray of pomegranate seeds and sherbet, and to her left, a scribe who recorded certain conversations for the palace archives. The concubine bowed deeply, lowering her eyes in the way custom demanded, and waited to be acknowledged. When the Valide spoke, her voice was even, Carrying no hint of indulgence here was the power that outlived beauty, the influence that was earned not in a single night, but over decades of navigating the currents of imperial life. Their conversation was brief, yet layered. The valide inquired about the concubine's studies in calligraphy, her skill in the oud, her attendance at recent poetry recitations. None of these questions were casual. They were assessments, a way to measure not just her talents but her discipline, her understanding that a woman's worth in this place was tied to her ability to represent the empire's refinement. As they spoke, other women entered and left the chamber, each interaction a thread in the vast, invisible tapestry of alliances that bound the harem together. When she was dismissed, the concubine carried more than the memory of the conversation. She carried the knowledge that she had been seen, and in the harem, being seen was a currency more precious than gold. Back in her own quarters, she allowed herself a moment to rest, reclining on a mound of cushions near a lattice window. From here she could hear the faint echo of footsteps on the marble floors below, the clink of dishes being prepared in the palace kitchens, and far off, the faint call of gulls over the water. The afternoon sun painted shifting patterns across the walls, and for a brief moment, the harem felt less like a cage and more like a separate world entirely, suspended between luxury and confinement. An attendant arrived with a small package, a length of pale green silk, its edges hemmed with silver thread. There was no note, but the meaning was clear. It was a gift, likely from one of the other women, a subtle gesture that could be the beginning of an alliance, or the opening move in a quieter game of rivalry. In the harem, kindness was often genuine, but it was never free of consequence. She considered her response carefully. To accept the gift without acknowledgement would seem dismissive. To show too much gratitude might place her in a position of obligation. She decided on the middle path, a small embroidered pouch of lavender buds, wrapped in plain cloth, a token of appreciation that neither promised too much nor too little. By the time she delivered it, the palace had shifted into its afternoon rhythm. Lessons resumed in the inner halls, music drifting from the training rooms, the gentle tap of brushes in the calligraphy chamber, the measured beat of tambourines in the dance hall. Each sound was a reminder that the harem was not idle, but constantly in motion, preparing, rehearsing, refining. As the light began to fade toward the late afternoon, the concubine knew the next part of the day would demand her greatest skill, the art of being present without appearing to seek attention. For in the hours before evening, the sultan sometimes walked through the gardens, and those chance encounters could shape destinies. By the time the sun slid lower, casting long golden shafts across the gardens, a subtle change moved through the harem like a silent tide. Servants began adjusting the positions of cushions and arranging the most fragrant flowers along the paths that led from the inner courtyard to the sultan's private promenade. Musicians quietly tuned their instruments in the shade, fingers testing strings without drawing attention. Even the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The concubine, now dressed in a gown of deep rose silk that caught the light with every movement, stepped into the outer balcony of her quarters. From here, she could see the faint glint of water beyond the garden walls, the distant shimmer of the Bosphorus under the waning day. Below, gardeners moved quickly but without haste, trimming a stray branch, sweeping a marble path, all under the watchful eye of the chief eunuch. This was the hour when possibility lingered, the hour when a simple walk could decide the fate of months, even years, of careful preparation. She descended the winding staircase toward the central courtyard, where other women had already taken their places, some seated beneath orange trees, others pretending to read poetry scrolls, their posture angled just so to catch the eye without overtly seeking it. The concubine chose a quieter spot, near a shallow pool where carp drifted lazily beneath the water lilies. The sound of water was soft here, calming, yet she knew her choice of position was strategic, close enough to the main path to be noticed, far enough not to seem as though she were waiting. When the sultan appeared, flanked by two attendants but walking at a slow, measured pace, the entire courtyard seemed to shift around him without moving. The air grew stiller, the conversations quieter, the glances sharper. He was dressed in a kaftan of ivory and gold, his turban wound with precision, the faint scent of musk preceding him. His gaze moved deliberately, noting, weighing, as though each woman was a page in a book he might choose to read or set aside. The concubine did not meet his eyes immediately to do so without cause, could be misread, but instead reached down to scatter crumbs for the fish, letting the movement draw his attention naturally. It was a subtle art, one every seasoned woman in the harem knew, to be seen without asking, to be remembered without speaking. The sultan paused near her for a moment, long enough for their eyes to meet, and in that brief exchange lay an entire conversation. Respect, curiosity, a question left unanswered. Then he moved on, and the tension that had gripped the courtyard dissolved in quiet sighs and resumed whispers. But she knew the moment would ripple through the harem. Some women would note it with envy, others with suspicion. In this world, every look from the sultan was a thread in a larger tapestry, one that could be woven into a pattern of favor or twisted into a snare of rivalry. As the evening deepened, the concubine returned to her quarters, her mind replaying the encounter. Outside, the muezzin's call drifted from the minarets, mingling with the fragrance of jasmine rising from the gardens. Inside, an attendant brought her a tray, figs drizzled with honey, small rounds of bread still warm from the oven, and a cup of thick, spiced coffee. It was a simple meal by palace standards, but tonight she ate with measured slowness, considering her next steps. The harem was not a place where luck alone could carry a woman forward. Here, attention had to be nurtured, opportunities shaped carefully so that they appeared to belong as much to the sultan's choice as to her own design. Later, as the lamps were lit and the corridors filled with the muted glow of gold and amber, she could hear the faint music drifting from the sultan's private pavilion. Somewhere within those walls, decisions were being made, decisions that could alter her life without her presence. She understood this truth as deeply as she understood her own heartbeat. In the harem, the moments when you were not in the room mattered as much as the moments when you were. Morning in the harem did not arrive with sudden noise, but with a slow, deliberate unfolding. The first hint of dawn came as a pale silver light filtering through the lattice windows, scattering patterns across the silk cushions and polished floors. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a call to prayer drifted through the palace grounds, the muezzin's voice rising like mist over the Bosphorus. The concubine awoke before her attendants came, lying still for a moment to watch the shifting light on the carved ceiling beams. She had learned to value these rare slivers of solitude when the weight of eyes and whispers had not yet settled upon her. A soft knock came at her door, not the loud, commanding knock of an order, but the careful, almost apologetic tap of her personal maid. The young girl entered with a brass tray, holding a steaming cup of rosewater tea, a small bowl of dates, and a folded note. The concubine took the note with steady fingers, though her heart quickened. In the harem, written words were rare and dangerous. Everything was meant to be spoken and forgotten. She unfolded it slowly, revealing a few lines written in careful Ottoman script. The message was not from the sultan, that would be far too bold, but from the chief eunuch, whose role was both guardian and gatekeeper. It was brief, almost cryptic. You may wish to be in the northern garden at the hour before noon. Nothing more. She read it twice, then placed it beneath her teacup, letting the rising steam blur the ink ever so slightly before tearing the paper into small pieces. The rest of the morning unfolded with the familiar rhythm of the harem. The communal bath was already warm, its domed ceiling dripping with condensation as women bathed in silence or traded whispers under the echo of running water. Perfumed oils and rose-scented soaps filled the air, masking the undercurrent of tension. Every glance here was loaded with meaning. A smile could be genuine or calculated. A silence could be respect or plotting. The concubine kept her demeanor serene, speaking only when spoken to, her movements fluid and unhurried. By mid-morning, the harem's great hall began to fill with women in fine attire, some rehearsing dances, others practicing the lute or reading verses of Persian poetry aloud to their tutors. Music drifted through the space, blending with the occasional trill of laughter that was just a bit too loud, too sharp to be accidental. As the appointed hour approached, she excused herself, moving toward the northern garden. This part of the palace grounds was quieter, shaded by towering cypress trees and cooled by the spray of a marble fountain shaped like a cluster of lilies. The garden was not a place of public display. It was a place of quiet conversation, of discreet arrangements. She arrived to find the chief eunuch waiting, his posture impeccable, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to walk with him along the gravel path, the sound of their steps muffled by the soft breeze. "You were noticed yesterday," he said at last, his voice low, more a statement than a compliment. She inclined her head, saying nothing. "There is an evening banquet tomorrow, an intimate one. Only a few will attend." He paused, glancing at her sidelong. "You will be among them. Make yourself memorable." With that, he turned away, leaving her with the weight of the message. As she stood there, the fountain's spray catching the sunlight, she felt both a spark of possibility and a thread of caution. A banquet could mean advancement, but it could also be a test, a chance for the Sultan to measure her charm, her wit, her restraint, in the company of others who would be watching her every move. The harem was a place of beauty, but it was also a stage, and tomorrow night, she would be stepping into a performance that could alter her fate. The day before the banquet passed like a slow tightening of a bowstring. From the moment she returned to her chambers, the concubine knew that every action, every detail of her appearance and behavior tomorrow evening would be weighed. In the harem, opportunity was never offered without hidden conditions. Her personal attendants, sensing the importance without needing to be told, began preparing her chambers for a long session of grooming. Bowls of henna were brought in, their earthy, metallic scent filling the room. The reddish paste was applied delicately to her fingertips and the soles of her feet. The pattern's intricate yet subtle designs meant not for public show, but for the quiet revelation of a graceful gesture, the lift of a hem in a candlelit room. The silk garments in her chest were unfolded and inspected one by one. For the banquet, she chose a caftan of deep emerald green, its weave so fine it seemed to shift color with every turn. Gold-threaded embroidery traced patterns of tulips and cypress trees along the sleeves, symbols of beauty and endurance. Beneath it, a layer of lighter silk in pale cream would move like water with her steps. Jewelry was another question. In the harem, the wrong choice could be dangerous. Too much gold, and one risked seeming arrogant. Too little, and one might appear unworthy. She selected a necklace of pearls, each bead perfectly round, the luster soft and unassuming, accompanied by a single emerald pendant. The chief eunuch's words echoed in her mind, "Make yourself memorable." But in the harem, memorability was a delicate art. It was not about dazzling openly. It was about weaving an image that lingered quietly in the mind, the way a faint perfume lingers in a room after its wearer has gone. That evening, she visited the perfumery, a vaulted chamber in the palace where shelves of glass bottles glimmered under lamplight. The perfumer, an elderly man with a mind like a library of scents, greeted her without surprise. He, too, knew tomorrow was significant. She allowed him to guide her through the fragrances: rose, jasmine, sandalwood, ambergris. In the end, she chose a blend of white musk and orange blossom, warm yet fresh, a scent that would not overpower the senses but invite curiosity. By nightfall, preparations gave way to reflection. Seated by the lattice window, she watched the lanterns of the palace gardens flicker to life one by one. She thought about the other women who might be at the banquet rivals dressed in silk and guarded smiles. She thought of the Sultan himself, whose favor could change a life overnight, but whose attention could also place a target on one's back. And she thought of the chief eunuch, the silent orchestrator of so much within these walls. His suggestion to be memorable might not have been only for the Sultan's eyes. In the harem, there were layers of intrigue invisible to those who looked only for beauty. As the moon rose, she allowed herself to rest, knowing that tomorrow would demand not just poise and charm, but a performance of controlled subtlety, in which every glance, every pause, every word would have its place. Under the pale morning light, the palace stirred to life in quiet, disciplined waves of activity. And within the harem, the air itself seemed to hum with the anticipation of the evening to come, though no one would dare speak of it too openly. For in a world where eyes and ears hid behind every carved wooden screen, speculation was as dangerous as ambition itself. Yet it was impossible to deny that every servant's step seemed, quote, icker, every whisper sharper, every glance more measuring, as though each person sensed that the banquet might subtly shift the invisible lines of power within these walls. And for the concubine at the center of this slow-moving current, the day unfolded with the precision of a ritual, beginning with her waking to the sound of a silver ewer pouring warm, rose-scented water into a basin, the attendant's hands steady as she helped her mistress rise from the low bed draped in fine linen, guiding her toward the marble-tiled washing alcove where thin streams of water trickled from brass spouts into shallow basins, steam rising in delicate curls that carried the faint perfume of sandalwood and mint, the heat loosening the tension in her limbs as her skin was cleansed with a cloth so soft it seemed almost like air against the flesh, and then dried with linen towels warmed by resting over coals, each movement unhurried. Not merely for comfort, but because the act of bathing here was not a mundane necessity. It was a preparation for being seen, an initiation into the heightened awareness of one's own presence in the eyes of others. From the bath, she was led back to her chambers where a low table had been set with the first meal of the day. Dates so ripe, they nearly burst with sweetness, flatbread warm from the oven, bowls of honey and clotted cream, and a delicate cup of coffee brewed thick and dark in a small copper saz, the bitterness softened by a trace of cardamom, and as she ate, she listened to the distant sounds of the harem, the muted rustle of silk as women moved between rooms, the faint tinkle of glass as perfumes were measured drop by careful drop, the clipped orders of the eunuchs as they ensured every corridor was spotless, for a banquet was never just a feast for the mouth, it was a display of the empire's perfection, down to the smallest thread of carpet. By midday, she was seated before the great bronze mirror in her chamber. The light filtered through a mashrabiyah screen so that it fell in patterned fragments across her face and hands, attendants working with deliberate rhythm, one winding strands of her hair into intricate braids coiled against the crown of her head, another painting her eyelids with the faintest wash of kohl, a third fastening the chosen necklace, so that the emerald pendant lay precisely where the hollow of her throat caught the light. And with each touch, she felt herself transforming, not into someone else, but into the most distilled version of herself, the one meant to be remembered by those who would see her only for a few brief moments tonight. And when the sun began to sink, and the sky shifted from gold to rose to deepening indigo, she stepped into the emerald silk kaftan, felt its weight settle across her shoulders, allowed the final drop of white musk and orange blossom to be pressed against her wrists, and then, with the chief eunuch waiting outside her door like the keeper of a threshold, she crossed the boundary from the private world of the harem into the wider, treacherous stage of the palace, where the banquet awaited, and where every look and word would become part of the unspoken ledger of power that decided the fate of those who lived within these walls. Under the gilded dome of the inner hall, where the air itself seemed to hum with the slow pulse of heat from braziers and the faint perfume of burning oud, she stepped into a space that felt less like a room and more like the inside of a jewel box, every surface alive with reflected light, gold leaf catching the flames, mother of pearl inlay shimmering beneath her gaze, and the low murmur of women's voices weaving through the chamber like threads in a silken braid, each tone measured, each gesture restrained, for here status was measured not by loudness, but by the art of presence, the ability to let one's beauty and bearing speak louder than words. And as she walked past a carved cedar screen, she caught the faintest whisper of laughter. Two younger concubines exchanging a conspiratorial glance before their eyes darted away, the ripple of intrigue passing quickly beneath the calm surface of courtly etiquette. And she moved on, Every step an exercise in control, her pace deliberate, her head high, her hands clasped lightly before her as though she had no urgent destination, though in truth she was being summoned to the mid-morning assembly, the daily convergence of the harem where the chief stewardess would read out the sultan's preferences, instructions, and, sometimes, quiet reprimands delivered in language so delicate it could pass for praise, and yet those who understood the nuance knew when a phrase was a warning, knew when the curve of a lip held the shadow of disfavor. And she, seasoned enough to read such codes, listened more to tone than to the words themselves, watching faces as much as hearing sentences, reading the way a shoulder lifted or a gaze fell, knowing that in this place survival depended as much on interpreting the currents as on avoiding their pull, and the assembly was a sea of movement within stillness. Women adjusting the folds of their robes, glancing at one another without meeting eyes for too long. The chief stewardess seated on a low divan like a vizier of the women's court, a parchment scroll unfurled in her henna-tipped hands, her voice carrying just enough to be heard but never enough to feel intrusive. Each name she spoke, received with a bow of the head, each instruction tucked away into the mental ledger that every woman kept. A silent accounting of who was rising, who was fading, and who, like herself, walked the careful line between visibility and safety. And when her name was called, it was without fanfare, a single note in the flowing recitation, an acknowledgement that she was to attend the Sultan's midday meal not as a serving presence, but as part of the quiet audience permitted to share in the atmosphere of his table, a privilege that was neither entirely intimate nor entirely ceremonial. For such invitations could mean favor, or they could mean she was being observed, assessed, weighed in the balance against others, and as the assembly dissolved into smaller currents, clusters of women drifting toward their own obligations, she moved with the tide, her attendants close behind, their presence, a reminder that nothing in this world was done alone, that even solitude here came with witnesses. And she turned down a colonnaded passage where the air was cooler, shaded from the sun that by now was angling toward its zenith, the scent of jasmine drifting from a courtyard garden, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe more deeply, to let the perfume settle into her lungs as though it could fortify her for whatever the meal would bring. The conversations unspoken yet communicated in glances, the way the Sultan might linger on a face or pass it over, the weight of his silence as telling as any word, and the passage opened into the preparation hall, where women skilled in the art of appearance tended to those who would be seen, combing and coiling hair into elaborate knots, fastening jeweled pins that caught the light like small stars, smoothing silks until they shone with the polish of water over stone, and she took her place upon the low-cushioned seat, letting deft fingers unwind the earlier braids, feeling the tug and release of strands being rearranged, the faint prick of a pin, the cool press of a gold clasp, each sensation a note in the long composition of readiness, and beyond the lattice screen she could hear the faint clink of copper trays being set upon low tables, the steady rhythm of preparation that underpinned the visible elegance of the harem's life, a reminder that for every moment of stillness, there were countless hidden labors moving silently in the background, making the performance possible. And as the final ribbon was tied, as the last drop of rosewater was pressed into her hair, she rose, her reflection in the polished silver mirror, looking back with a composure that felt both natural and learned. And she stepped forward into the next act of the day, the marble underfoot cool, the air alive with a quiet anticipation that seemed to follow her down the hall toward the meal where eyes would watch, words would measure, and the currents of favor would shift in ways as subtle and as powerful as the tides themselves. Beyond the preparation hall, the marble corridor opened into a vestibule where the ceiling arched high, painted in deep lapis blue and flecked with gold leaf stars, as if the very night sky had been brought indoors to remind all who passed beneath of their place in the cosmic order. And here 2 eunuchs waited in perfect stillness, their expressions composed masks of duty, their hands resting lightly on the hilts of ceremonial daggers they would never draw except in ritual. And with a shallow bow they gestured for her to proceed, their silence more eloquent than any greeting, for this was the threshold to the Sultan's presence, and the closer one drew, the less words had meaning, replaced instead by glances, gestures, the choreography of rank. And she moved through the vestibule into the antechamber, where the air was warmer, thick with the mingled aromas of saffron, roasted lamb, cinnamon, and the faint, resinous sweetness of frankincense curling upward from bronze braziers set at the corners. And on either side, attendants knelt beside low tables, arranging platters in perfect symmetry, pyramids of dates glistening with honey, bowls of jeweled rice studded with pomegranate seeds, dishes of yogurt swirled with mint and garlic, flatbreads still warm from the hearth stacked beneath embroidered cloths, and pitchers of sherbet glowing amber in the filtered light, each vessel crafted so finely that its handle curved like the neck of a swan, its surface etched with arabesques that seemed almost to move as the candle flames wavered. And she felt the pull of the space, the way it coaxed every sense awake, not to overwhelm but to prepare, to place the body in a state of receptivity. For here dining was never just eating, it was ceremony, theater, diplomacy, and in some ways, a form of unspoken negotiation. And at the far end of the chamber, past the gleam of polished brass and the shimmer of silk banners, the Sultan sat at a long, low table, not at the center as might be expected, but slightly to one side, a position that allowed him to see the entire room while appearing unassuming. His robe of deep crimson trimmed with sable, the fabric pooling like liquid over the cushions beneath him, his face composed, the dark arch of his brows giving him a look at once thoughtful and imperious. And she lowered herself into a graceful bow, before taking her appointed seat along the periphery of the inner circle, close enough to hear the conversation if one listened carefully, far enough to be able to observe without drawing too much attention. And as the meal began, servants moved in a silent current, replacing dishes as soon as they lightened, refilling cups before they were half drained, offering morsels on the tip of long-handled spoons carved from ivory, and the voices in the room rose and fell like the tide. The Sultan speaking little, his remarks sparse but decisive, occasionally turning to a favorite advisor or a court poet whose verses served as subtle interludes between courses, each couplet a ripple that shifted the mood just enough to soften the weight of silence, and all the while she kept her gaze lowered but her attention sharp, catching the flicker of a glance exchanged between two other women, the slight pause before a servant obeyed an instruction, the way one courtier's hand lingered on the rim of his cup as though resisting the impulse to speak, and when the Sultan's gaze passed over her it was neither warm nor cold, but measuring, as if noting her presence, her posture, the exact shade of silk she wore, and then moving on without comment, and she understood that in this world, such passing attention was a kind of currency, neither a gift nor a threat, but an opening, a thread that could be woven into something greater if handled with skill. And as the platters dwindled, and the final course was brought forth, a delicate confection of rosewater and pistachio, wrapped in sheets of spun sugar, she took her portion with the same poise she had carried from the moment she entered, aware that every movement was part of the unspoken record kept in the minds of those who mattered. And when the meal ended, and the Sultan rose without ceremony, the women and courtiers bowing in unison, she felt the subtle shift in the room, the way the air seemed to exhale. The performance concluded for now, though the consequences of what had been seen and heard would ripple outward long after the doors closed behind him, and she followed the stream of women back toward the harem's private halls, her mind already turning over the details, the pauses, the glances, storing them away for the quiet calculations that would shape the rest of her day. Under the dimming glow of late afternoon, the procession of women wound its way back into the harem's labyrinth of corridors, each one a river of silk and whispered perfume, the sound of soft slippers on marble, broken only by the occasional chime of a bracelet brushing against an inlaid doorframe. And here, Away from the Sultan's formal presence, the atmosphere shifted, voices lifting in cautious conversation, a ripple of relief mixed with something sharper rivalry disguised in laughter, alliances carried in subtle compliments, and she walked among them, her mind still replaying every detail of the banquet, weighing what could be shared, what must be hidden, for in the harem, truth was never given whole. It was traded in fragments, bartered like jewels, and the currency was trust, the kind that could be spent only once. And as they entered the Hall of Rest, a vaulted chamber painted in cool tones of turquoise and ivory, she felt the change in air cooler here, scented faintly with lavender and dried rose petals stored in clay jars along the walls. The sound of water trickling from a bronze fountain at the center, its basin ringed with cushions where the women sank into easy poses, their bodies draped in silk robes lighter than breath, their eyes sharp despite the languid posture, for this was the social heart of the harem, where stories were told under the guise of entertainment, each one laced with meaning that only some could decipher. And soon a lute player appeared, her instrument cradled like a child, her fingers plucking notes that shimmered through the chamber like sunlight on water, drawing sighs and soft hums from the listeners. And another woman older, her hair streaked with silver beneath her veil, began to speak, weaving a tale of an ancient queen who had won a kingdom not with armies, but with the patience to listen when others rushed to speak. A story that in another place might have been just a story, but here, in the harem, was a quiet lesson disguised in legend. And she listened, her gaze drifting to the faces around her, noting who leaned forward, who smiled faintly, who looked away, storing it all like threads she might later weave. For here every hour between public duties was not idleness, but the work of positioning, aligning, adjusting the small balances that determined one's survival. And as the music faded and the women began to drift towards smaller alcoves in twos and threes, she excused herself, stepping through an archway into a narrower corridor that led to the baths, the air growing warmer, humid with the scent of steam and soap, the low hum of conversation echoing from tiled walls. And as she disrobed in the antechamber, folding her robe with care, she caught her own reflection in the polished brass mirror eyes, calm, mouth steady, posture flawless, and she thought of how much of herself lived behind that surface, hidden, waiting. Because here in the heart of the palace, in the world gilded and caged, the truest parts of a woman could not walk openly. They had to be guarded like the Sultan's own treasures, shown only when it was safe, or when the risk was worth the gain. Under the high domed ceiling of the bath chamber, the air shimmered with heat and moisture, a fragrant mist curling from marble basins where rosewater and steam mingled, carrying the scent of petals crushed at dawn and warmed slowly over braziers until the room became a garden in haze, and she stepped inside with measured grace, the hem of her silken shift dampening instantly as it brushed the mosaic floor, a geometric bloom of blue and gold tesserae that glistened like tiny jewels under the lamplight, each piece cut and placed by artisans whose names were long forgotten, yet whose work endured in every curve of the arch, every symmetry of the pattern, and the sound here was muted, softened by steam and stone, the quiet, punctuated only by the faint drip of water from carved lion head spouts, a rhythm that seemed ancient, older even than the palace itself, as if the walls had been listening for centuries. And her attendants moved around her with the familiarity of ritual, unpinning her veil, loosening her sash, folding each garment with care before placing it on a low cedar bench where the wood, seasoned with thyme and perfumed by oil, released its own warm scent into the air, and she sank onto the smooth marble slab at the center, heat seeping into her skin as one servant poured a cascade of warm water over her shoulders, the rivulets tracing slow paths along her arms, her back, her sides, and another took a silk pouch filled with crushed olive kernels, working it gently across her skin in circles, so light they seemed to coax the weariness from her bones rather than scrub. And the world beyond this chamber faded, until there was only the steady rise of steam, the tactile softness of silk against skin, the faint murmur of the women's voices speaking in the fluid, musical Turkish that curled like smoke through the mist, and she thought, fleetingly, of how many women had sat here before her brides brought to the harem on their wedding night, favored concubines heavy with the sultan's child, even foreign captives whose beauty had earned them a place within these guarded walls, and each must have felt the same strange mixture of vulnerability and power. Naked in body, yet clothed in the privilege of proximity to the throne, and when the attendant rinsed her with a final sweep of water, the warmth was followed by a brisk coolness as a linen towel was wrapped around her, drawing her back into the waking world, and the silence of the bath gave way to the faint hum of the outer corridors, where footsteps echoed like distant drums, and the scent of spiced coffee drifted from some unseen chamber, promising that her day, still young, would unfold in ways both expected and unseen. As she rose, hair damp and heavy down her back, she felt the weight of the palace around her not oppressive, but inescapable, like the embrace of a story she'd been born into and could never leave. And so she walked forward, through the latticework of steam and shadow, toward whatever the next hour would demand of her. Through the arched doorway, the light shifted, cooler now, tinged with the pale gleam of morning sun filtering through intricate mashrabia screens, their carved cedar lattice casting patterned shadows on the polished marble floors, a web of geometry that moved with every flutter of the breeze from the inner courtyard, where a fountain murmured in the center, its water catching glints of gold, as if scattering coins across the surface. And she stepped into this space with bare, silent feet, the linen at her shoulders drinking in the faint chill that lingered beyond the hammam's heat, her senses still sharpened by the bath's intimacy. And before her, the harem's life unfolded in slow rhythms. Women gathered on low divans, upholstered in damask, embroidering silk panels with threads fine as hair, their fingers quick yet unhurried, each stitch a petal, a star, a fragment of a larger tapestry destined to adorn a chamber or be sent as a gift beyond these walls. And in the alcove, two young girls knelt over a carved ivory box, its lid inlaid with mother-of-pearl, drawing out glass perfume bottles like treasures, uncorking them to compare the scents of musk, amber, and jasmine, giggling in whispers so as not to disturb the older women deep in conversation, their voices low, deliberate, weaving gossip and politics in the same breath. And from the far side came the faint plucked notes of an oud, each string's vibration lingering just long enough to touch the edges of memory, and the concubine crossed the courtyard toward a shaded portico, where a brass tray of breakfast awaited honeycombs still dripping with gold, flatbreads warm from the oven, dates glossy with syrup, and a small bowl of almonds dusted with cinnamon, and she sat, folding herself onto the cushions in the fluid way of those who have learned to wear grace as naturally as breath, lifting a piece of bread to her lips, tearing it to dip in honey, the sweetness flooding her tongue as a servant approached with a porcelain cup of thick, dark coffee, the surface swirling with the faint bloom of cardamom, and as she drank, the bitterness grounded her in the moment, anchoring her in a day that, though it began with such softness, would soon bring the rigid rituals of court audiences with the Valide Sultan, lessons in music and poetry, perhaps even a summons from the Sultan himself. And in that thought lay the dual nature of her existence. The splendor of privilege braided tightly with the tension of constant watchfulness. For here, beauty was a currency, wit a weapon, and loyalty a blade that could cut both ways. And as she set the empty cup down, hearing the echo of its base on the tray, she felt the invisible currents of the harem shift around her, subtle as the breeze stirring the jasmine vines, carrying with it the promise or the warning that the next summons could change everything. The day's true pulse began after the morning quiet broke, when the corridors of the harem filled with the measured shuffle of slippers on marble and the low hum of voices preparing for the day's obligations, the air perfumed with fresh incense burning in silver censers that hung from delicate chains, their smoke curling upward in pale ribbons that dissolved into the carved ceilings above. And she rose from her place by the courtyard, smoothing the folds of her silk robe, its indigo sheen catching the sunlight in waves, and walked toward the main salon where the women gathered before dispersing to their duties or lessons, her steps light yet deliberate. For in these spaces every gesture was seen, every movement assessed, and she passed under an arch draped with sheer gauze curtains that billowed with the faintest touch of air, entering a room lined with low couches piled high with embroidered cushions, their colors deep as garnets, sapphires, and pomegranates. And at the center, on a raised platform, sat the elder attendants, keepers of protocol and tradition, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. And she offered a bow, not too deep, not too shallow, the kind that spoke of respect without surrender, and was met with the faintest nod, permission to join the others. And soon the murmur of voices swelled as trays of writing tools were brought in polished reed pens, pots of black and red ink, sheets of parchment, smooth as skin, alongside books bound in leather, their spines gilded, for today was a day of letters, the composing of messages to be sent beyond the harem walls, some carrying poetry to friends or family, others discreet political counsel to trusted allies. And as she settled into her place at the long, low table, she felt the cool touch of ivory beneath her wrist and dipped her pen into ink, her first lines crafted with the balance of sincerity and caution that was second nature here. For words, once loosed, could return as arrows, and through the latticed windows came the sound of the fountain still whispering in the courtyard, joined now by the soft call of doves from the rooftop gardens above. And somewhere deeper within, a lute began its plaintive song, a melody that wound through the air like a thread binding the moment together, and she glanced up only once, catching the gaze of another concubine across the table, a look that held both curiosity and warning before bending again to her parchment, each stroke of her pen shaping not just ink on a page, but the careful architecture of survival in a world where beauty and skill were prized. Yet both could vanish with the turn of a single breath. The afternoon unfolded with a shift in tone, the sunlight now filtering through lattice screens in fractured gold, casting patterns that danced across the tiled floors like fragments of some silent, ancient script. And she moved from the salon to the baths, where steam curled in lazy spirals, toward the domed ceiling painted with faded constellations, the air thick with a mingled sense of rosewater, sandalwood, and warmed marble, each breath a slow indulgence and a reminder of the harem's hidden luxury. For here, ritual was not simply for cleansing the body, but for reaffirming the order of things, and she slipped from her robe, its silken weight pooling at her feet, before stepping onto the warm, smooth stone, attendants greeting her with shallow bows, their practiced hands guiding her toward the central platform where the heat gathered most, and warm water cascaded over her shoulders from a polished copper basin, tracing rivers down her spine, while the muted sound of distant voices echoed against the walls, softened by steam, and as one attendant worked a paste of crushed herbs and oil into her hair, another began the slow, rhythmic motion of exfoliating her skin with a coarse cloth, each pass revealing a new softness, the heat loosening every knot of muscle until she felt her limbs heavy yet pliant. And through the haze she could just make out other women in varying states of repose, some reclined, eyes closed, lost in private thoughts, others speaking in whispers too low to carry, their laughter sudden and brief like sparks in the dim light. And all the while the water sang its endless song, dripping from the carved stone mouths of fountains into deep basins below, a sound as constant as breath itself. And when at last the ritual ended, she was wrapped in a linen cloth, still warm from the brazier, its weave coarse against her softened skin, and led to a smaller chamber where she could recline, sipping a drink chilled with snow brought from the distant mountains, its sweetness lingering on her tongue. And here, in this suspended moment between duty and desire, she let her eyes drift closed, the memory of the morning fading into the measured rhythm of her heartbeat. The knowledge that outside these walls the world churned with politics, ambition, and danger muted for now by the thick, protective walls of the harem. Though even in this cocoon, she knew the day's true tests had yet to begin. As the evening's approach signaled the transition from the languid pace of the afternoon to the calculated formality of night, she emerged from her repose in the smaller chamber, the faint chill of the melting snow on her tongue, replaced by the warm, spiced air drifting in from the kitchens, where the scent of saffron, cinnamon, and slow-cooked lamb mingled with the sharper edge of pomegranate and vinegar, each aroma a reminder that the night ahead was not hers to control, but hers to perform within. And she allowed the attendants to lead her toward the dressing quarters, a place alive with the quiet energy of preparation, where silks in shades of deep crimson and peacock blue lay folded alongside golden belts and strings of pearls, and the room hummed with the delicate chaos of brushes sweeping rouge onto lips, pins fastening jewels into hair, and low voices reciting the evening's order, who would be called first, who would wait, and she knew that timing here was a language of its own, that to be summoned too soon or too late could alter everything, and so she submitted to the artistry of transformation, standing still as her hair was drawn into intricate braids that wound like rivers toward the crown of her head, each knot anchored with a pin tipped in jade, while her gown, cut to skim the line of her shoulders and fall in cascading folds, whispered against her skin with every breath. And once adorned, she was led to the long mirrored hall, its polished floor reflecting the shimmer of lamplight until it seemed she stood upon a river of gold, and here the air shifted, quieter, heavier, as the gates to the reception chamber came into view, their panels carved with scenes of past rulers, each a reminder that history here was not written on parchment, but in the lives of those who served within these walls. And as she paused at the threshold, the murmur of conversation beyond rose and fell like a tide, the clink of goblets and the faint strain of the oud reaching her ears. And she inhaled once, deeply, knowing that every gesture, every glance tonight could either strengthen her place or set the slow erosion of her standing in motion. And with that breath, she stepped forward, her shadow spilling ahead of her into the light. The morning in the harem moved with a rhythm that was neither rushed nor lazy, a rhythm that belonged to a world sealed from the chaos of the city outside, and yet one that pulsed with its own invisible tensions. The first light had long since crossed the latticed windows, its golden strands softened by filigree shadows dancing across the tiled floors. By now, the concubines had been through their morning rituals, bathing in the warm, fragrant steam of rosewater, dressing in silks whose folds whispered like secrets, and adorning themselves with subtle touches of scent from amber, musk, and sandalwood. But after these morning duties, life in the harem did not dissolve into idleness, as some imagined. It entered the intricate theater of courtly living. Servants moved quietly between chambers carrying trays of fruits, honey, and warm bread, still breathing the aroma of the oven. Musicians plucked at strings in distant rooms, their melodies so soft, they felt like they could be swallowed by the air. And yet every action, every exchange, was subtly watched. In the harem, even laughter was political. The older concubines, those who had survived years within these walls, knew that the casual moments of the day were often when alliances were formed or broken. A glance could carry weight. A compliment, if directed toward the wrong person, could echo as an insult in someone else's mind. The concubine whose day we follow understood this well. She had been brought here years ago, a girl of 16 from a province far removed from the imperial heart. Her life before had been one of hills and fields, the cries of market vendors, and the taste of river water in summer. Now her world was walls and marble, calligraphy and court intrigue, scents that spoke of both beauty and confinement. This morning she was summoned to the chambers of the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan and the supreme authority in the harem. The summons came not as a demand, but as an unspoken decree. It was always an honor, and always a test. The path to the Valide Sultan's rooms wound through corridors of quiet luxury, past fountains whose waters whispered in shallow basins of carved alabaster. Light from narrow windows fell in patterned streams, cutting the air into strips of shadow and glow. She walked with her head bowed just enough to show deference, but her eyes missed nothing the way a servant paused to bow. The rustle of silks from another concubine disappearing into a side room, the scent of saffron drifting from a nearby kitchen. Entering the Valide Sultan's presence was like stepping into a different climate. The air itself seemed warmer, denser, infused with the faintest trace of frankincense. The older woman sat on a divan piled high with embroidered cushions, her eyes sharp yet not unkind. The concubine knelt, head lowered, awaiting the gesture that would permit her to speak. It came a slight inclination of the hand. The conversation began in the language of courtesy, but beneath the surface it was something else entirely. Questions about her health, her embroidery, her reading of poetry, these were not idle inquiries, but measures of discipline, loyalty, and discretion. The Valide Sultan spoke slowly, each word a jewel set carefully in place. She was testing memory, obedience, and perhaps most of all, the ability to navigate the currents of court life without floundering. When the meeting ended, the concubine was dismissed with a faint smile and a gift, a small vial of attar of roses sealed in glass. Such a gift was not merely perfume. It was a sign, a symbol, a subtle message whose meaning she would have to interpret. Returning to her own quarters, she moved through the garden courtyard, where fig trees cast dappled shadows on the mosaic floor. A pair of younger concubines sat near the fountain, speaking in low voices, their laughter soft and careful. She knew better than to interrupt. In the harem, friendships could be real, but they were never without risk. A word shared in confidence could become currency in someone else's game. In her chambers, she unrolled a length of silk she had been embroidering for weeks, a scene of cypress trees and a moonlit garden, a place she had never seen but could imagine in detail. Needlework was not just a pastime. It was a way to cultivate patience, focus, and quiet dignity. As the needle dipped and rose, time in the harem moved forward in its peculiar way, slow in the telling, but swift in the living. Outside, the muffled sounds of the palace reached her only in fragments. The call of a muezzin from a distant minaret, the low murmur of guards changing shifts, the clatter of a tray somewhere beyond the next wall. These sounds were the heartbeat of a world that was both vast and small, and she had learned to listen for what they did not say. Midday brought the communal meal, an occasion as layered in meaning as any formal audience. Seated among other concubines in a long, low hall, she ate from polished copper plates, the food a careful balance of delicacy and abundance, lamb stewed with apricots, pilaf flecked with pomegranate seeds, bread soft enough to tear without a knife. Conversation moved like a dance, graceful on the surface, yet never without undercurrents. Compliments were exchanged, stories told, but eyes watched for reactions, for slips, for moments of too much candor. By the time the meal ended, the day had already shifted subtly. Whispers moved through the harem news of the Sultan's return from a hunting expedition, a rumor about a favored concubine's sudden illness, a new shipment of fabrics from distant lands. Each fragment of news could ripple outward, touching lives in ways that were invisible now, but inevitable later. And as she rose from her seat, the concubine felt the weight of the day's next hours pressing in. The harem was a place of beauty, but it was also a place of constant performance. To survive here was to master the art of being seen and unseen at the same time. The afternoon in the harem did not simply arrive, it unfolded like a slow-turning fan, each hour revealing another layer of ritual, observation, and unspoken competition. After the communal meal, the concubines dispersed into smaller clusters, each to her own pursuits, some to embroidery, others to music, a few to reading or practicing the intricate dances that might be performed before the Sultan. The concubine we follow retreated for a time to the small balcony attached to her chamber. its carved wooden screens shielding her from full view while allowing her to gaze upon the inner gardens. Below, the marble paths traced graceful lines between beds of tulips and roses, their colors bright even under the soft haze of afternoon. The scent was thick jasmine, magnolia, and a faint trace of the kitchen fires from beyond the harem's walls. She breathed it in, feeling the layered aromas as one feels the layers of a memory, sweet, fleeting, and tinged with the knowledge that nothing in this place truly belonged to her. Soon, a servant arrived with a quiet message. Her presence was requested in the practice hall. This was not unexpected. The harem's life was not only about beauty and conversation, it was about discipline, training, and readiness. A concubine had to be prepared to entertain, to soothe, to speak with wit, to listen with grace, to move with elegance. In the practice hall, the light came through high windows scattering across polished wooden floors. A lute player sat in the corner, plucking soft, deliberate notes. The concubine took her place among a few others, each in gauzy silks that allowed for movement, each carrying within her the tension of knowing that every practice was also a test. The dance began slowly, steps measured, arms flowing like water, eyes lowered in a controlled humility that was itself an act of power. As the music built, so did the movement's turns, that let the silk skirts flare like blossoms. Pauses where the dancer's stillness became its own kind of beauty. Here, skill was not about raw energy, but about control, about the ability to suggest meaning without stating it outright. The concubine had learned this over years, how to make a glance last just long enough to intrigue, how to let a hand hover in the air before falling with deliberate grace. After the session ended, she was not dismissed immediately. The instructor, an older woman whose authority in the harem was unquestioned, called her aside. There was a brief conversation, low-voiced, about posture, about the rhythm of a certain turn, about the importance of never appearing eager even when one's heart was restless. Such guidance was never casual. It was part of the slow molding of a concubine into something more than a mere companion. Returning to her chamber, the concubine paused in the corridor as two younger women passed. Their conversation cut short at the sight of her. She caught the tone, if not the words, something edged with envy, perhaps, or caution. In the harem, one learned to recognize these shadows in speech, the way a smile could hold both warmth and warning. Back in her quarters, she poured herself a cup of sherbet flavored with lemon and mint, the coolness cutting through the thick afternoon air. She drank slowly, letting her mind drift. Beyond the walls of the palace, the city would be alive with its own rhythms, the clang of metalworkers' hammers, the cries of merchants in the bazaar, the calls of boatmen along the Golden Horn. But here, those sounds came muted, distant, as though the harem floated in a different time altogether. A knock at the door brought her back. Another message, this time an invitation, or rather a summons, to join a small gathering in one of the side salons. Such gatherings could be pleasant, but they could also be arenas for subtle rivalries. When she arrived, the salon was lit by low lamps, their light softened by colored glass. Cushions were arranged in a loose circle, and a platter of dried fruits and nuts sat at the center. The women spoke in measured tones, their laughter light, but beneath it she could hear the careful placing of words, the testing of boundaries. A story was told about a visit from a foreign ambassador's wife, who had been shown only the outer gardens and had still spoken of the harem as though she knew its secrets. Another woman recited a fragment of poetry, her voice rich and low, drawing appreciative nods. The concubine listened, contributing only when it felt right, never too much, never too little. She knew that in these rooms, one could gain or lose standing without even realizing it until later. As the gathering ended, she excused herself and walked the long way back to her chambers, past the library where shelves of manuscripts stood like silent witnesses to centuries of thought. She glanced in, catching the faint smell of old paper and ink. For a moment she lingered, tracing the titles with her eyes: histories, medical treatises, collections of verse. The harem was not only a place of beauty, but of learning, though this truth was less often spoken. In her own chamber again, She lit a small oil lamp and returned to her embroidery. The design had grown since morning, the cypress trees taller, the moon more defined. Each stitch was a small claim against the slow erosion of the self that life here could bring. Outside, the sky had deepened toward evening, and the call to prayer rose once more, threading through the walls like a ribbon of sound. The day was not yet done, but its weight was already settling into her bones. She sat quietly, the needle moving, her mind both here and far away. In the harem, one learned to live in both places at once, the world as it was, and the world as it might be, if one were ever free to choose. The last light of day thinned to a pale ribbon along the upper lattice, and the harem shifted into its evening skin, quieter on the surface, yet charged beneath with the low thrum of intention. And she felt that current the way a swimmer feels the pull below a calm river, a subtle insistence guiding feet, breath, thought. And as the lamps were lit one by one along the corridors, small wells of amber that pooled against blue tile and chased long shadows into carved corners, attendants moved with bowls of glowing coals to sweeten the air with oud and mastic, the smoke rising in delicate braids that threaded the archways and clung to silk like a promise of ceremony, and her chamber answered the hour with its own preparations. The emerald caftan brushed smooth again until it shone like wet leaves, the pearl necklace restrung so the pendant would fall true. The vial of rose attar from the valide set upon a small bronze saucer as if it were both relic and test, while beyond her screen she could hear the palace inhale kitchens sending up the final trays, musicians tuning in, ascending fifths, eunuchs checking latches with a single decisive click, and she sat in stillness at the edge of it, palms open on her knees to let the slightest tremor pass harmlessly through her hands before it could climb to her mouth or eyes, for the evening would ask for the sort of poise that turns the body into a vessel for meanings it must not speak aloud. And when the knock came soft, twice, then the barest pause it carried not urgency, but inevitability, and she rose, allowed her maid to touch the scented oil to the inner wrists, and at the hollow of the throat, let the comb slide once more through hair newly coiled and pinned with jade, and followed the chief eunuch's measured pace through the corridor where the marble held the day's warmth like stored breath, past the small window slit that gave a brief glimpse of the Bosphorus stippled with moonlight, past the door where a pair of neophytes practiced their bows to an invisible audience, past the niche where a brass ewer reflected the lamps as a chain of suns, and then into the vestibule of the intimate salon, where tonight's gathering would unfurl not as a spectacle but as a net fine, nearly invisible, yet able to catch futures within its mesh, if one swam recklessly. And the room itself was arranged to hide intention. Low tables set in a crescent rather than a line, cushions in dusky jewel tones that bled into shadow at their edges, two braziers set not opposite but askew, so that heat and scent traveled in contrary streams, and the musicians placed slightly behind a carved screen so their presence was felt before it was seen, a design that kept the ear leaning forward, because to lean is to give the self. She took her place along the quiet arc where those not quite summoned yet not quite dismissed are made to sit, a zone of possibility that can be inheritance or trap depending on the night's weather. And as the others entered, one in peacock silk whose laughter skimmed surfaces without ever wetting them, another in garnet velvet whose silence gathered like velvet itself, heavy, seductive. She measured their angles, as a calligrapher measures slope and stroke, for the room writes in bodies before it writes in words. And soon the Sultan arrived without procession, the door's hinge offering only a breath of sound, and he took his position with the same economy he brought to command. A figure at ease in stillness, robes of winter white trimmed in fur that turned under lamplight to a thin edge of fire, and his gaze did not sweep but alighted brief touches, like a falcon testing currents before commitment until it rested, for an instant and no longer, upon the valide at the far end, whose return glance was equal parts benediction and calculation. And then the evening began to pour itself from its vessel. Sherbets of quince and snow, fig rounds lacquered with honey and black sesame, slivers of lamb scented with cinnamon and mint, each borne on copper trays whose hammered dimples kept the lamplight rippling as if the sea had slipped indoors and agreed for an hour to be service, and conversation took its first steps polite, unsharp, moving from weather in the mountain provinces to the spring's early tulip bulbs, to a recent gift of manuscripts from a scholar in Damascus. And here the court poet was called to offer a few stanzas, his voice unshowy but exact, the rhyme arriving exactly when the ear had decided to stop waiting for it and was therefore most grateful. And while he spoke, she did not stare at the Sultan, for that would reduce listening to theater, but she did what the seasoned do. She watched the listening of others, who leaned, who blinked too slow, who pressed lips at the mention of drought. And when the poem turned briefly to loss, a riverbank remembered, a reed bed cut for winter sheaves, a silence in a courtyard, after a child has left the room, let itself be sincere, briefly, with a hush as fine as silk, drawn over a bowl. And then it released itself again into the work of liking one another without entirely trusting one another, and she held her place within that balance as a cymbal holds its ring just below audibility. And yet no evening is content to remain one thing for long. And so when the small crisis came, it arrived, as they often do, with no more herald than a breath caught too late. A porcelain cup slipping from a trembling novice's hand, its arc short, its fall mercifully slow motion, its break not a shatter but a clean split, two halves kissing the tile with a sound like the closing of a book, and in the pause that followed the pause, she moved neither first nor last, precisely timed to be read as instinct rather than design, lifting her silk hem a fraction, kneeling with a grace rehearsed in 100 other kindnesses, pressing her palm to her own breast before extending that same hand, open and empty, to the girl in a gesture that offered apology as shield, like saying with the body what cannot be said without implicating the room. That accidents sometimes arrive where fear is made to perch too near the cup's rim, and the novice, startled into weeping she had clearly spent all day refusing, let the tears fall as if permission had been granted by rank itself. And the valide, reading the movement as a sentence whose subject and verb were both mercy, nodded once, and the chief eunuch's chin dipped the necessary fraction to mark the matter closed without public rebuke, and the cup's halves were lifted away to the side table, where an old attendant would bind them later with lacquer and gold powder, the crack made glorious in the Japanese manner some traders had brought as a rumor and the palace had made into craft, and the evening, relieved to have proved itself gentle, exhaled. Later, when the lute was passed among the women for a round of verses, she did not refuse and did not hurry. And when her turn arrived, she set the instrument upon her knee, as one might set a sleeping cat, careful of its dignity and tuned by ear to the room's temperature, rather than to any abstract pitch. And this song she gave was neither love nor lament, but a small bridge. Couplets about a cypress that grew where a courtyard's corner kept the wind from scouring the soil. Lines about the patience of water-shaping stone from within, a refrain that returned like a palace footstep you can time your breath by. And she stopped before the song wished to go on, because to end a measure early is to leave the ear obligated. And obligation is the closest safe thing to desire in a house like this, and when the instrument moved on, her hands were empty again, which is to say free, and she set them one upon the other in the lap, the way a seal is set upon wax, and the night slid forward. A tray of candied violets, a small riddle exchanged between two advisors that concealed policy and play, a glance from the Sultan to the poet that meant, write that down without summoning a scribe, the faintest shift of the valide's rings against one another like tiny abacuses keeping tally of gratitude and debt, and somewhere within this fabric a new thread pulled tight. A murmur at the salon's edge, a whisper that smelled of bronze and old jealousy. A rumor's first tooth testing the silk poison, such words prefer the company of wine and low light, but the old risks wear new perfumes. And tonight it was Sherbet's turn to be suspect. For a favored woman had been carried out 3 nights prior with a fever no physician could persuade to turn. And when fear wishes to live, it will keep house in any vessel, and yet the chief eunuch did not let the whisper take a second breath. He moved not toward the rumored tray, but toward the space between rumor and its listeners, placed 2 palms together, bowed to the valet, and spoke aloud, a request that sounded like hospitality but was in truth a small test. Let the sherbet be poured again anew from snow and quince in the Sultan's presence so that all might watch its making, and let it be served first to he who asks for its proof. And while the room turned that into a performance of relief, she did a different arithmetic. How fear chooses a shape, how kindness alters it, how the night will remember what posture each body chose while the snow melted. And when her cup came not first, not last, she tasted and tasted the second sip more slowly, because the second sip is always the one that tells the truth about a thing, and found only fruit and winter's clean hush, and let the cup rest upon the saucer without noise. The evening was not derailed, but it had been rerouted through a narrow pass, and when it widened again, the stars outside had climbed to that hour when gardens seemed to be listening, and the gathering thinned in a way that allowed each leaving to become its own message, and the Sultan rose the way a decision rises, without explanation, without apology, only with completion, and the room unspooled from around him, and she followed the slow tide toward the corridor where the harem gathers itself back into its privacy, and the valet's stewardess intercepted her with a parcel wrapped in indigo gauze, light as a bird in the hand. And inside was not jewelry nor scent, but a strip of paper folded into a narrow pleat, upon which a single line of script had been drawn in vermilion, the verse she had sung, rewritten in the valet's own hand with one word altered, corner to courtyard, a correction without censure, a blessing that says, be larger. And she bowed to the absence of the giver, and felt the correction take root under the breastbone, the way a seed recognizes a patch of earth meant for it. And the corridor's lamps led her home. In her chamber the silence did what good silences do, held until it was sure it would not be broken by anything careless, and then allowed itself to be filled with small rituals that stitched the day to the night, unpinning jade, and setting each piece in its own shallow dish, loosening the coiled hair, and feeling the scalp's small gratitude, folding silk so that tomorrow's creases will be honorable ones, opening the lattice a finger's width to slide the air in over the floor like cool cloth, tipping 1 drop of the rose attar not upon skin but onto the inside seam of the pillow so that the scent will rise where the dream will breathe it. And at the low table she unfolded the indigo gauze to fashion it into a sash for the plain robe she wore to think, because thinking here benefits from small honors, and she set a reed pen to a scrap of rough paper practice only, not record to write the altered line again and again until the body could find it without seeking, and the words laid down their ink like a trail in a garden, her name nowhere upon the page, as is necessary. And then she rested the pen and let the hand remember the novice's cold fingers, the cup's clean break, the golden seam that would mend it into something more valuable than before, and she understood the lesson's shape and accepted it. That the palace cannot bear what does not bend, that even fracture can be turned to ornament if you learn the art of owning the scar, and the hour had now become that gentle border when the harem sleeps in tears, some with eyes closed, some telling quiet truths to the ceiling, some listening to water talk itself into circles in a fountain. No one sees in the dark, and she drew her bedding around her like a shoreline, lay on her side so the heart would be held by the body instead of falling against the ribs, and she let the day pass through her once more from its farthest thread to its closest knot summons, scent, tea, dance, verse, ruma, snow, correction, each bead touching the next without snag. And when sleep came, it did not take her by the throat, but by the hand. And in the dream, the courtyard had no corners, because the walls had learned to curve, and the cypress grew not taller but more patient. And water found its way through stone by asking the stone to remember when it, too, was water. And in the morning, which would come, as it always does, with the sound of a single bird finding the first note, she would wake with the taste of quince still clean upon the tongue and the sense not knowledge, not yet, but orientation that the thread she had placed in the room had held, that the net had not caught her but something else entirely, and that in a house where the difference between seen and unseen is the first mathematics a girl must learn, she had remained legible to the right eyes and illegible to the wrong ones, which is to say she had lived another day and turned it into a page the palace would read again without realizing, and perhaps that is the closest any life here comes to authorship. Under the gray-blue hush, before the first call to prayer, the palace held its breath, the way the sea holds its tide a heartbeat longer than it should, a quiet swelling inside stone, wood, and silk. And in the harem that breath became a soft rearranging of the night lamps shuttered by careful hands. Embers in braziers coaxed back into their small red planets, slippers aligned so the morning would find them facing the right direction. And she woke with the taste of quince still lingering like a clean vowel on the tongue, and with the line corrected by the valide already lying smooth in the mind, where it would not snag. And she remained still for the span of 3 slow breaths to feel whether the day wished to hurry or to unfold, then sat, drew the plain robe about her shoulders, and dipped fingers into the basin where last night's water had cooled to a polite mirror. Letting its skin break around her knuckles with that shy sound water makes one surprised, and outside the lattice a single bird found the first note and loosed it toward the pale rim of morning, and the muezzin answered from somewhere far enough away that his call arrived softened by air and distance, and the day, thus announced, began to write itself upon the palace. Steam rose obedient and fragrant in the hammam as attendants heated water in copper-bellied pots. Jasmine along the inner walls relinquished its darkest scent to the cool before the sun. The kitchen courtyards woke in clatter and cinnamon, and within the private chambers the old women of the harem unrolled the woven list of what must be done: repairs, rehearsals, audiences, inspections, and those quiet acts that do not burden paper, remembering, forgetting, forgiving something a little, hardening something gently. She bathed in the smaller bath alcove attached to her room. No ceremony this hour, only warmth sluiced across collarbones, the familiar kiss of soap and stone, the nap of linen toweling the last of sleep from the skin, and when her maid brought the first tray, thin bread with bubbles like small moons, honey tasted from the comb, olives coaxed toward sweetness and brine, and coffee dark as a promise, she ate, with the modest appetite of someone who knows what a day can take, if invited too boldly, and with the cup's rims still warm against her lower lip, the soft knock sounded that means message not command, and the maid slid in a folded slip of paper tied with indigo thread, and on it a hand she recognized by the way it feathered its descenders, the stewardess of the valide, stating not request but path after private prayer. Come to the northern corridor where the windows face the green roofs. Bring your writing reed. Do not wear jewels. She dressed in pale silk, the coat lore of almond milk, and left her throat unadorned so the morning could settle there, coiled her hair in a low knot that would not draw notice, tucked the smooth-bodied reed into the sleeve where a pen belongs when it is not yet a pen, and walked the long way past the library on purpose. Because the smell of vellum and lampblack blesses thought, and because in that smell the heart stands straighter. The northern corridor cooled the skin as she entered. Green glazed tiles on the roofs beyond held last night's dew, as if the sky had lent its smallest stars to the palace while it slept, and the valide's stewardess stood with her back to the light, so that her face was readable but not indicting, and she inclined her head the small degree that says, "Now we will discuss the thing that is not urgent but is important," and from her sleeve she produced a thin board of polished walnut with 2 sheets pinned at the top, one already inscribed, one still waiting, and she turned the top sheet to show a short letter laid out with a precision that was not fussy. 4 lines to the imperial architect, written as a question that is also a command. asking whether the corners of the new women's courtyard could be softened into arcs in deference to the old idea that sharp angles cut wind and invite dust in a way that a curve does not, and whether the budget for such stone could be found not in the treasury but in the goodwill of a guild eager to be remembered, and the stewardess said nothing more than, "You will copy this and carry it in your hand to the chief eunuch, so he will see your hand and measure your steadiness this morning." And the girl in almond silk bowed to the task as to a bowl of water set before thirst, sat upon the window bench where daylight made a small lake upon the wood, breathed upon the reed to moisten its business end, tipped the inkstone to wake its shine, and began to write the same hand a little differently, the way a voice will sing a melody again without betraying the first singer. And the letters came with the ease that grows from long patience. Not artful, not meager, strokes like measured kindness. And when she had finished, the stewardess traced the line of the pen with her eye, as one tests a seam with finger, and said, "You will also add the postscript, that the women are willing to sit through the inconvenience of scaffolding, if it means that the wind becomes our guest and not our master." And she added it, not as plea, but as hospitality, and then reversed the board so the blank sheet looked up at her and said, "Now write to your own tutor in Persian and tell her we will shift our lesson to the afternoon, for visitors will brush the harem in the late morning, and we must not be found bent over Rumi when the treasurer wishes to look at accounts." And she wrote that too, but with a private flourish where only the tutor would see it, a small bird's tail at the end of the line that says, "I can bear postponement without surrendering joy." The chief eunuch took the letter with hands that never fumble paper and with eyes that weigh paper as some weigh coins, and he nodded not to her but to the work, and that was better than a nod to her would have been, and he said, "Walk with me as far as the blue stairs." And as they moved past the windows that sit pieces of the Bosphorus, and past the small painted scene of a leopard that no one remarks upon because remarking upon it would make it trivial, he explained how the day would break itself into hours. A brief inspection by the keeper of accounts to ensure that the embroidery sent to the orphan house still matched the thread requisitioned last month, a visitation by a scholar from Damascus, who sought permission to copy a certain manuscript of poetry, a short recital by 3 of the youngest for the validay's ear only, and a distribution of linen to the wet nurses, because a ship from Bursa had brought bales of fine cloth. And if cloth is left in bales, it forgets it is meant to become touch. And when they reached the blue stairs, he released her from his shadow and she from his. And both left the impression of mutual usefulness where they parted, which is the cleanest currency in a palace. Back in the women's workroom, the long tables were already strewn with the small proofs of industry, bundles of thread bound like little sheaves, hoops of pearwood clamped about patient fabric, needles nested like silver fishes in a shallow dish, and she took her place among 6 others to finish the hemstitch on swaddling cloths, the color of whisper, the kind of work that builds a wall against useless thinking and invites the mind to make long, gentle maps. And they spoke with voices set to the volume of decency about how much cumin to add to lentils when the weather turns wet, and what to do when a child's cough will not leave a room even after onion and steam, which is to say they held the day's edge between their fingers without cutting themselves. And when the keeper of accounts slid in with a clerk behind him, they did not stiffen, no. They kept stitching, because nothing proves honesty like the continuation of the honest thing, and the keeper watched not their fingers but their eyes, then compared numbers on a small slate, then thanked the room with the exact gratitude owed to women who had turned lines on parchment into cloth that will greet new breathing, and he left with the smallest inclination to her in almond silk, because he recognized her hand from the corridor's letter, and now knew what kind of line her body made when it drew a line upon paper, and knowledge like that is stored the way a key is stored. The mid-morning sun slid the color of ripe apricot over the mosaics as the scholar from Damascus, a man whose beard was as careful as his syntax, was received in the outer garden by 2 elder women and given a cushion that had remembered the shape of other scholars. And she, not of rank to host him, passed at the edge of his attention with a tray of sherbet, because humility at the right distance is a kind of seeing, And when he asked, eyes alight as if the manuscript were fire, to copy 2 odes that the palace kept out of respect for both the poet and the moths that love paper too fiercely, the elder women granted the request with conditions wrapped in courtesy, and he left a gift in return. A small bottle of ink whose black was said to hold a winter sky in it, and she later uncorked it to test whether the rumor was honest, and found that indeed the black was not hard but soft, like midnight laid flat and asked to behave. The noon meal did not herald itself with abundance, but with sufficiency. Rice with a flirt of saffron, a stew of chickpeas and lamb that let the lamb be humble, cucumbers asked to be cool and permitted to answer, and while they ate in 2s and 3s beneath the cedar trellis, the talk threaded itself around the rehearsal to come, the treasurer's mood of late, the favorite's fever that had become yesterday's rumor and today's cautionary quiet, and a young one in peony-colored silk showed a brooch shaped like a swallow that she had found on her cushion this morning. Her mouth arranged to suggest accident, though it spelled intention, and when the circle of women drew nearer like petals to a bee, she let the brooch pass near her hands, but not into them, complimented the workmanship, admired the way the stones had been taught to think they were feathers, and said nothing about whether gifts left without names are flowers or snares, because the lesson is not to announce that one has seen the snare, but to step around it without even stirring the grass. After prayer, the tutor in Persian came as the letter had promised, her veil gray as a dove's wing, eyes merry in the way of someone who has seen grief obey the leash of a couplet, and they sat upon the mat with the manuscript open between them, and read 3 ghazals, as if the world had nothing else to press upon them, turning each metaphor slowly in the mouth like a hard candy that asks to last. And when they came to the line about the reed that sings only because its heart has been carved away, the tutor tapped the margin and said, smiling, "Do not be persuaded to admire suffering more than the song." And she smiled back, not with her mouth, but with her shoulders relaxing, which is a rarer smile, and wrote the line again in her own hand, in the white along the edge, because writing a thing is the closest safe way to owning it here. Afternoon stretched itself long and cat-like across the cushions, and the palace settled into that hush where movement becomes deliberate and thought becomes useful, and she used that hush to sew the last hem on the last swaddling cloth, and to mend a seam in the pale robe at the shoulder where salt had encouraged thread to forget its duty, and the valet stewardess returned with eyes that said, "We will now learn who remembers what is owed," and the distribution of linen to the wet nurses began as a ceremony of competence names, checked against mouths to be fed, bolts unrolled to become lengths, lengths measured against forearms, forearms turned into burdens, burdens received with gratitude and not apology, and when the last bundle had found the arms meant for it, the courtyard felt as if it had inhaled cleanly after coughing for weeks, and the old women sat a blink longer than the work required, so their bodies could tell their bones, "You have done something necessary." Then came the small inspection none announce but all feel, the treasurer of the harem, a woman whose gaze makes numbers behave, whose jewelry never sings when she walks, because singing is for those who need announcing, entered with 2 assistants to ask questions about oranges, lamp oil, and whether the musician's strings were gut or silk this season, and when her attention landed on the almond silk girl, she did not smile, but she allowed her eyes to rest and said, "I have heard your hand can carry a line without trembling even when eyes are upon it. Carry this," and set a small lacquered box into her palms that had the weight of a stone taught to trust, and inside lay a shallow porcelain bowl, mended in gold along a fault line so frank it could be a map of a beloved river. And the treasurer said, "There are visitors tonight, and the valet would have this upon the low table where kindness has work." And the girl understood that the bowl and she would do the same job under different names, and said only, "Yes." The rehearsal for the youngest passed like light across a page, quick, precise, leaving the impression of pattern without handing over its secret. And when the valet nodded at the end, one child exhaled audibly and was permitted to giggle at her own lungs, and everyone pretended not to hear. because mercy prefers to be allowed to act as if it is not a performance. And as the sun leaned its shoulder toward the water and the muezzin drew the evening across the roofs like a shawl, the day turned its face toward its second act. She returned to her chamber, let the maid unmake the knot in her hair, and comb its dark river until the scalp hummed its gratitude, put on the plain robe once more out of stubbornness against too much shimmer too early, and sat with the bowl mended in gold upon the table, and looked at it long enough to hear what a thing says after it believes you will listen. It said nothing clever, only that it was more itself after admitting where it had broken, and that a line, once filled with light, can find its way in a dark room. And she touched a finger to the seam not to trace it, but to acknowledge it as one greets a scar on one's own knee when no one is looking. The chief eunuch's summons came not in a voice, but as a presence at the door, the way Weather stands there before entering, and he regarded the bowl, then her, and said, "You will set it where the guests can see it and not remark upon it unless the story is asked for." And she nodded, because to tell a story before it has been requested is to set dinner upon a guest's knee. And he added, almost an afterthought, "The favorite's fever breaks and rises, breaks and rises. The house will prefer gentleness from mouths tonight," and left her with that staff to carry. She dressed for twilight in silk the color of the inside of a fig, not the showy skin, but the reddened quiet within. Bound with the indigo gauze the valide had wrapped last night's letter in, because one should wear a kindness back into the world, even when no one knows the thread's history. Perfumed herself not at the wrists this time, but lightly at the ankles, so that scent would rise when she moved, rather than arrive before her, and took up the bowl in both hands, which convinced the bowl that it mattered. The salon for the visitors, it would be a small party of women of rank from a provincial governor's household, come to exchange courtesies, alms, and weather, was already a geography of welcome when she entered. Cushions set so that conversation would flow without eddies, lamps hooded to flatter faces without lying, grape leaves dressed in lemon brightening the air like small green mirrors, and she set the golden-seamed bowl upon the low table at the exact point where hands empty of preoccupation come to rest, and then withdrew to the zone where presence is felt if needed and not noticed if not. The evening proceeded as a river proceeds when no one tries to name its parts, greetings that acknowledge old threads and spin new ones. The quiet sparkle of women who know how to leave rank at the door while never misplacing it. The trade of recipes the way kings trade borders. A prayer murmured in gratitude for cloth that will warm strangers. And when eyes at last fell upon the mended porcelain, and the guest with the wise shoulders asked the question without the question, "This bowl has been well taught," she gave the story sparingly. That some things break and become more visible by being healed, that in this house we do not hide the seam when we can gild it, that the line of repair is not apology but honor, and the guest nodded as one nods to a line of poetry that has done an honest day's work, and the conversation moved on as if it had taken a blessing into its pocket. There was a moment of small danger, because there always is. The peacock silk woman drifted near with the swallow brooch now pinned at her breast, and let her hand rest upon the mended bowl, with an ownership the bowl had not granted, and said, "I have always loved flaws, in a way that asks the room to love hers." And the almond silk girl tilted her head as if grateful and replied, "We are fortunate when our teachers are gentle, which place the flaw back in the world where it belongs and release the bowl from anyone's particular claim." And the brooch glittered as if it had understood nothing, which was safest for everyone. When the guests left with bundles of linen and a memory of lamplight that would make their own lamps warmer, the house folded the evening up and set it upon the shelf of days done well, and she carried the bowl back the way one carries a sleeping cat, and set it upon the same bronze saucer where the rose attar had sat in the morning, a small altar to the scene that does not ask to be erased. Night widened. The musicians laid their instruments down as if tucking in children. The kitchens sank their fires to a red language. Only the last pots understand. Somewhere in the far end of the women's wing, a lullaby braided Hebrew and Turkish and a mother's breath into a rope strong enough to pull a baby across the river of fever and back to shore. She wrote 2 lines to the Persian tutor in the same soft black that had arrived from Damascus, not to postpone anything now, but to thank her for the warning against admiring pain. And she added a sketch of a bull with 1 brilliant vein, more to amuse the tutor than the paper, and then set the pen aside because to write too long in one day is to ask words to look thinner tomorrow. Before sleep, she stood in the courtyard that the architect would soon curve, looked at the corners as if they were stern aunties at a wedding, and imagined them rounded like the inside of a wrist, wondered what songs the wind sings to a curve, that it refuses to sing to an angle, and told the air in a voice even she barely heard, "We will be kinder," meaning the house, and also quietly, meaning herself. She lay down on sheets that had learned her weight, and let the last thought be not of rank nor rumor, nor the arithmetic of glances, but of how water becomes itself by moving, and of how she had moved, not loudly, through this day, carrying lines, carrying cloth, carrying a bowl, carrying the difference between gentleness and softness where anyone could test it, and sleep came bearing a tray of dreams, like figs opened upon a plate, one of a courtyard without edges, one of a reed refusing to be only its wound, one of a seam that glowed in the dark like a map, which is to say the mind already knew how to walk tomorrow, and morning waited, patient as linen folded on a shelf, ready to be spread smooth and asked to be useful again. Morning in the harem was never simply the arrival of light. It was a slow unwinding of shadow, the first soft sound of slippers on polished stone, the hush before the chorus of voices that would weave themselves into the day's fabric. She woke to the filtered glow that seeped through the carved wooden lattice of the mashrabiyah, turning the air into a pattern of light and shade across her face. The scent of rosewater lingered faintly from the night before, clinging to the cloth of her pillow. Somewhere beyond her chamber, the fountain in the inner courtyard spoke in its patient language, each drop a syllable of something older than memory. She rose without haste, for haste in the harem was an unspoken discourtesy. Every movement was part of a choreography designed to soothe the eyes of those who might be watching. Her feet found the cool tiles, each one a small reminder of the hands that had shaped and set it. As she wrapped herself in the light cotton robe that hung at the foot of her bed, she thought of the day ahead not in terms of tasks, but in terms of textures, of the silks she might fold, the brass trays she might polish, until her own reflection became a pale ghost within them. The threads of conversation she might overhear and silently knot into her private tapestry of knowledge. Outside, the first tray of the morning was making its way along the corridor, borne by a younger girl whose bracelets chimed in soft protest at the wait. On it sat a copper pot of coffee, the surface shimmering with a sheen of cardamom-scented oil, and beside it small bowls of dates, their skins wrinkled like old parchment but inside still sweet as late summer. She accepted the cup with a nod, letting the bitter steam wake parts of her mind that the fountain could not reach. In the distance, a musician was tuning an oud, plucking strings that carried the faint ache of night into the day. Somewhere above, in the high windows where only swallows dared to go, the first birds had already begun their weaving between rafters. Soon the senior concubines would stir, their rooms become small kingdoms of preparation, coal jars opened, hair oiled and coiled, fabrics chosen with the same precision as a merchant inspecting pearls. But for now, there was still a thin thread of quiet, a border between the solitude of sleep and the theater of waking. She walked through the corridor toward the baths, passing niches in the wall where small lamps still burned, the wax pooling at their bases like frozen tears. The baths were a world unto themselves, steam curling upward like the breath of a dreaming animal, the marble floors holding warmth from water that had been poured hours ago. She undressed slowly, folding each piece of cloth as if it might be called to testify about her later. Immersing herself in the pool, she felt the surface break and heal around her, her skin tightening with the shift in temperature. Other women entered, their voices low, their eyes taking measure not of beauty, but of alliances. She did not speak unless spoken to. Her silence was her currency, one that spent itself in careful increments. A girl beside her murmured a question about the coming banquet. but she only smiled in reply, letting the steam blur the shapes of their faces. The attendant poured water over her shoulders from a jug, the stream catching light from the high windows so that for a moment it seemed molten. When she rose from the bath, skin damp and hair unbound, she felt the weight of the day's first decision settle on her what to wear. In the harem, clothing was a language. A sleeve too wide could whisper carelessness, a sash too bright could shout ambition. She chose a deep blue robe edged in gold thread, the color of lapis and late evening, and tied it with a plain silk cord. Her hair she braided simply, knowing that complexity and style could invite questions about whom she intended to impress. By the time she returned to her chamber, the corridor was alive with footsteps, murmurs, the soft thud of a cushion being dropped, the metallic sigh of a door hinge. The day was beginning to take its shape, and she stepped into it like stepping into a familiar but unpredictable river, knowing that every glance, every word, every pause might ripple outward in ways she would not see until night returned. The afternoon in the harem was a different creature from the morning, slower in some ways but heavier, with currents that were not always visible. Light fell in longer stripes through the mashrabia screens, shifting with the sun as if the walls themselves were breathing. The heat rose, not oppressive but steady, seeping into the marble floors and making the air shimmer faintly in the courtyards. She moved through it as one might move through a tapestry, careful not to snag a single thread. In the central salon, the senior concubines had gathered for embroidery, their needles glinting like small weapons between the flickers of conversation. The sound of the needle pulling through fabric was almost like the rustle of palm leaves in a hot wind. Each woman worked on a different piece, some on garments destined for the sultan's chambers, others on ceremonial cloths that would be given as gifts to visiting dignitaries. She sat near the edge of the group, her hands occupied with a strip of silk onto which she was sewing a narrow braid of gold. It was work that required the kind of attention that allowed the ears to wander, and wander they did. She heard the careful arrangement of gossip, how one girl's absence from the baths this morning had been explained by illness, though someone else swore they had seen her slipping toward the upper wing, how a musician had been dismissed for playing a melody too closely associated with a rival court, how the chief steward's wife had been seen speaking with the head of the kitchen staff in a tone that was just a shade too familiar. These things were never spoken outright, but shaped like vessels that the listener had to fill for herself. When the call to prayer rose from beyond the palace walls, the room fell into a hush that was not total silence, but a deep rearranging of sound, the shifting of cushions, the quiet setting aside of work, the low sighs of bodies moving from ease to reverence. She prayed without closing her eyes, letting them rest on the mosaic floor, tracing patterns she had walked over every day and yet still finding in them new constellations. Afterward, the women dispersed in twos and threes, some returning to their rooms, others making their way to the kitchen court, where the air was richer, spiced with cumin, saffron, and the slow-cooked sweetness of figs and syrup. She followed that scent, knowing that the afternoon meal would be laid out soon. The kitchen was its own kingdom, ruled not by beauty or favor but by the precise economy of skill knives moving fast and sure, pots lifted from the fire at exactly the right moment, hands that could judge salt by the pinch without ever tasting. She helped carry a tray laden with small dishes, lamb stewed with apricots, rice perfumed with cinnamon, rounds of flatbread still warm from the oven, and bowls of yogurt cooled with mint. The food was not served to all at once. In the harem, meals were like tides, flowing toward different rooms at different hours, depending on the rhythms of the day and the whims of the women. She ate in her chamber, seated on the floor with the tray before her, tearing pieces of bread to scoop up the lamb, the flavors rich and layered, as though each bite were a story that had traveled far to reach her. When she finished, she rinsed her fingers in rose water, watching the way it caught the light in the small copper bowl. The afternoon deepened toward evening, and the air began to cool, carrying with it the faint echo of drums from somewhere beyond the harem's walls. This was the hour when the garden drew her most strongly. She slipped out through the colonnade, where the marble pillars were striped with shadow, and into the courtyard garden. It was a carefully composed world, orange trees heavy with fruit, jasmine vines spilling over trellises, a central fountain whose spray caught the last light in a scatter of diamonds. She walked the narrow paths, her fingertips grazing the leaves, the scent of the flowers settling into her hair. A pair of peacocks moved ahead of her, their tails dragging like spilled silk, the iridescence of their feathers shifting with each step. Near the fountain, a younger girl was reciting verses from a Persian poem, her voice low but clear, the words curling into the air and dissolving like smoke. She paused to listen, the rhythm of the lines stitching itself to her own breathing. As the sun lowered, lanterns were lit along the arcades, each flame a small heartbeat against the coming dark. She knew that soon the evening rituals would begin, the gathering in the music hall, the recitation of stories, the subtle display of beauty and wit before the eyes that mattered most. She returned to her room to prepare, selecting a robe the color of pomegranate skin and fastening a belt of woven gold around her waist. A touch of kohl to the eyes, a drop of attar at the throat, and she was ready not for conquest, but for the quiet art of presence. The way one can fill a room, not by speaking the loudest, but by listening in a way that makes others speak to you. In the music hall, the light was low, the cushions deep, the air thick with the mingled scents of incense and wine. Musicians sat cross-legged with their instruments, the first notes of the oud flowing out like warm honey. A storyteller took his place, his voice a river that carried the room with it, tales of ancient kings and lovers who crossed deserts, of battles fought for honor and for nothing at all, of treasures found and lost again. She listened, not for the truth of the stories, but for the truths they concealed, the places where the teller's voice lingered too long or skipped too quickly. The evening stretched on, the music and words weaving themselves into the walls, into the fabric of the cushions, into the air she breathed. By the time she returned to her chamber, the palace had quieted again. The fountain's voice was softer now, as if speaking to itself. She undressed slowly, folding each garment as if the day might ask for it back tomorrow. Lying down on her bed, she let the weight of the day settle over her. Not as a burden, but as a quilt stitched from silk and shadow. Outside, the night gathered, patient and deep, and she drifted into it as into warm water, carrying with her the sound of the oud, the scent of jasmine, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be another day in this world within a world, where every glance and gesture was a line in a story that no one would ever write down, but that everyone was always endlessly telling. The dawn did not so much arrive as seep into the harem, a slow unfurling of light through carved latticework, turning the air pale gold before touching anything else. The first sounds were soft and deliberate, the muted splash of water in the marble basins, the whisper of bare feet on polished floors, the murmur of the early prayers drifting like smoke from the small mosque within the women's quarters. She woke to these sounds, her body already aware of the rhythm before her mind stirred. Rising from her bed, she wrapped herself in a thin silk robe, the fabric clinging lightly to her skin in the cool air. A servant entered silently, setting down a tray with a bowl of warm water, a cloth, and a small dish of rose-scented soap. She washed her face slowly, savoring the sensation, the way the water carried away the last traces of sleep. Outside her chamber, the corridors of the harem were just beginning to wake. Some women moved briskly toward the baths, eager to secure a place before the room filled. Others lingered in the hallways, exchanging quiet words that hinted at last night's dreams or today's intentions. She made her way to the baths, the path familiar yet always subtly different, as the play of morning light changed the look of the tiles, the gleam of brass fittings, the shadows between columns. The bathhouse was warm and fragrant, the air heavy with steam and the scent of lavender oil. She disrobed and stepped into the central room, where water flowed constantly from carved stone fountains into shallow pools. The sound was steady and soothing, a liquid heartbeat that filled the space. She sat on the warm marble edge of one pool, dipping her feet into the water before sliding in entirely, feeling the heat wrap around her like a second skin. Around her, other women were already immersed in their own rituals, one having her hair washed by a friend, another scrubbing her arms with a rough cloth, another leaning back with her eyes closed as steam curled around her face. Bathing in the harem was not merely about cleanliness. It was a performance of grace, a way to be seen without looking like you were trying to be seen. She let herself drift in the water for a while, then moved to the smaller, hotter pool where she could feel her muscles loosen and her thoughts slow. Afterward, she rinsed in cooler water, the shock waking her fully. Wrapped in a large cotton towel, she returned to the outer room, where a servant had laid out her clothing for the day. A soft underdress of pale blue, a long robe of cream silk embroidered with gold along the sleeves, and a sash dyed the deep red of pomegranate seeds. Dressing was its own ritual, each layer a note in the music of the morning. She fastened her sash, then added a pair of pearl earrings, a gift from a senior concubine who had once favored her, and combed her hair into a loose braid that hung over one shoulder. Breakfast was served in the smaller dining hall platters of flatbread, bowls of fresh cheese, figs, and dates arranged in careful spirals, cups of strong, sweetened coffee whose aroma filled the room. She sat with 3 other women she knew well enough to speak to, but not so well as to trust entirely. Conversation was light, focused on the weather, on the expected arrival of a merchant from Damascus bringing new silks, on whether the gardens had been watered enough to keep the orange blossoms from wilting in the heat. Beneath these topics ran other currents who had been summoned to the Sultan's private rooms last night, which musicians had been dismissed without explanation, whether the chief eunuch's lingering cough was cause for concern or simply a trick to draw sympathy. After breakfast, the women dispersed to their tasks or pleasures. Some returned to their chambers to read or nap. Others went to the workrooms to sew, weave, or practice music. She chose the garden. The morning air was still cool enough to make the walk pleasant, and the sight of the dew still clinging to the leaves gave the flowers a kind of private shimmer. She paused at the fountain, dipping her fingers in and watching the ripples spread outward in perfect circles. The garden was both sanctuary and stage, quiet enough to think, yet open enough to be seen by the right eyes at the right moment. As she strolled along the gravel path, she passed the aviary where birds from far-off lands preened and called in strange melodic voices. A parrot from India greeted her with a garbled phrase it had learned from some forgotten courtier. She smiled but did not stop. Further on, she reached the shaded alcove where a musician sat tuning his oud, the sound soft but resonant in the still air. She lingered there, listening, until the melody shifted into something familiar, a folk tune from her own childhood, transformed by the instrument's deeper voice. The day ahead would be long, filled with both visible duties and the invisible labor of navigating the web of alliances, rivalries, and unspoken rules that defined harem life. But for this moment, in the cool shadow of the garden, with the sound of the oud wrapping around her, she allowed herself to simply exist, neither watched nor watching. A small piece of stillness in a place that never truly slept. And when the call to prayer rose again, this time in the full brightness of morning, she turned toward it, the sunlight breaking across her face like a promise and a warning at once. By mid-morning, the palace was fully awake, and the harem's quiet order began to give way to its subtler chaos. Messengers moved quickly through the corridors, carrying folded notes sealed with wax, some to be delivered to the senior women, others to be hidden away before they reached their intended eyes. The chief eunuch's voice could be heard in the distance, calling instructions to the guards posted at each doorway. From the kitchens drifted the smell of spiced lamb simmering slowly, a promise of the midday meal hours away. She walked along the upper gallery that overlooked the inner courtyard, the polished stone cool beneath her slippers. Below, 2 young concubines practiced a courtly dance under the supervision of an older woman, their steps precise, but still tinged with the eagerness of youth. The rhythm of their footwork was accompanied by the faint jingling of tiny bells sewn into their hems. As she leaned against the carved wooden railing, she felt eyes on her, not hostile, not yet, but assessing, as always. Here, even idleness had to be performed with purpose. She descended the curved staircase into the embroidery hall, where rows of women sat with their heads bent over silks and velvets. The room smelled faintly of beeswax from the candles kept ready in case the light dimmed. She took her place near the window, where a soft breeze carried in the scent of jasmine from the courtyard. Today's task was to finish a panel of gold thread embroidery, destined for a ceremonial robe. Her hands moved automatically, the needle rising and falling in a steady rhythm, each stitch a small act of discipline. The women around her spoke in low tones, their conversation drifting from idle gossip to coded commentary on palace affairs. A mention of the Sultan's mood could be disguised as a remark about the weather. A warning about a rival could be hidden in a story about a quarrelsome bird. She listened without appearing to, absorbing the currents of power that flowed invisibly through the room. At midday, a bell signaled the break, and trays of food were brought in, flatbreads still warm from the oven, bowls of lentil stew, plates of cucumber and mint, and sweet halva cut into neat squares. She ate lightly, preferring to keep her senses sharp. As they ate, the talk turned to the arrival of new women from the provinces. Some would be brought directly into the harem. Others, deemed less likely to please, would serve in lesser roles within the palace. It was always a moment of subtle upheaval, as new alliances formed and old hierarchies shifted to accommodate or reject the newcomers. After the meal, she made her way to the music room, where a small group of women gathered for the afternoon lesson. A court musician, his back straight and his voice measured, demonstrated the opening phrases of a song meant for the Sultan's entertainment later in the week. The melody was intricate, winding in unexpected ways, like a path through a garden designed to confuse intruders. She took up the small frame drum and joined in, matching her rhythm to the musician's gestures. Music here was more than ornament. It was a language, a way to speak directly to the Sultan's moods without ever addressing him in words. When the lesson ended, she lingered behind, letting her fingers trace the smooth surface of the drum, committing the pattern to memory. The sun was lower when she returned to her chamber, its slanting light casting long shadows across the floor. She paused by the narrow window, looking out over the palace walls to where the city spread toward the horizon, its minarets rising like slender spears into the sky. From here, the noise of the streets was distant, softened into a hum. It was a view she cherished, a reminder that the harem, for all its grandeur, was still only one world among many. She changed into a lighter robe, this one the color of pale apricots, and lay down for a short rest. Sleep in the afternoon was never deep. It was more a drifting, a loosening of the mind without fully letting go. She dreamed of water again, this time a river running through a walled garden, the current pulling both gently and inexorably toward a place she could not see. She woke to the soft knock of a servant at her door, bringing a message. She was to attend the Valide Sultan in her private salon before evening prayers. Rising quickly, she smoothed her robe and fixed her hair, then followed the servant through the winding corridors to the grandest chamber in the harem. The Valide Sultan, mother of the ruler, sat on a cushioned divan, surrounded by an air of quiet authority. Her robes were layered silks in shades of deep blue, her hands adorned with rings that caught the fading light. She gestured for her to sit, and the conversation began not of trivialities, but of arrangements for an upcoming festival. There were roles to be assigned, performances to be rehearsed, and appearances to be managed. Every word the Valide spoke carried weight. Every pause was deliberate. She answered carefully, offering suggestions where invited, withholding opinion where it was wiser to be silent. When the meeting ended, she bowed her head and withdrew, her mind already sorting through the implications of what had been said and what had not. The evening call to prayer filled the air as she returned to her chamber, its cadence settling over the palace like a slow exhalation. Soon the lamps would be lit, the corridors filled with the glow of oil flames reflected in polished brass. The day's rhythm would shift again toward the performances and gatherings that marked the harem's nights. But for now, there was still a moment of quiet, and she stood at her window once more, watching as the last light slipped from the sky, carrying with it the unspoken promises and subtle threats of another day within these walls. The night in the harem unfolded like a stage performance, every movement lit by the warm shimmer of oil lamps and the silver wash of moonlight streaming through latticed windows. As the corridors filled with the soft swish of silks and the faint ring of anklets, she made her way toward the gathering hall, where the evening's entertainments would be held. The hall was vast, its ceiling painted with scenes of gardens and pavilions, and the air carried the mingled scents of rosewater, frankincense, and the honeyed pastries laid out for later. Cushions in jewel tones were arranged in a semicircle before a small raised platform, upon which musicians were tuning their instruments, a knee flute, an oud, and the deep, resonant timbre. She took her place among the women, settling with a graceful fold of her robe, and let her gaze wander without appearing to linger. The Sultan himself would not attend tonight, but his absence did not lessen the importance of the gathering. Here, every glance, every whispered exchange could be as consequential as any royal decree. The first performance began with a solo dance, a young woman whose movements rippled like silk in the wind, her arms unfurling with each note of the music. The audience watched in a silence that was almost reverent, broken only by the occasional murmur of appreciation. As the dance ended and the applause rose like a tide, trays of sherbet in tall, narrow glasses were passed among the guests, their sweetness a contrast to the sharper undercurrents of the room. She accepted hers with a polite smile, sipping slowly, letting the coolness soothe her throat. When it was her turn to perform, she rose and stepped toward the platform, her heart steady but her mind alert. Tonight, she would accompany the court singer on the frame drum, a rhythm meant to echo the pulse of a restless heart. The first beat struck like a knock at a closed door, and then the song began a melody of longing, threaded with sorrow, winding upward toward a resolution that never quite arrived. Her hands moved with precision, each strike and pause woven into the fabric of the music. As the final note faded, there was a breath of stillness before the room erupted in applause. She bowed her head and returned to her seat, aware that every ear had heard her skill, and every eye had marked her composure. After the performances, the gathering shifted into smaller clusters, women leaning close to exchange confidences, laughter spilling softly between them like perfume from an overturned bottle. She joined a group near the far wall, where the talk ranged from trivial complaints about the fit of a new gown to the strategic speculation about the Sultan's plans for the spring campaign. She contributed little, content to listen, her mind sorting the conversation into pieces she might use later. The night deepened, and one by one the lamps were extinguished, shadows reclaiming the edges of the hall. She walked back to her chamber through the dim corridors, her steps unhurried. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of the gardens beyond the walls. In her room, a single lamp burned low, casting a pool of golden light onto the patterned carpet. She removed her jewels and set them carefully into their lacquered box, then loosened her hair so it fell in a dark river over her shoulders. Sitting by the window, she looked out at the city again. The minarets stood like sentinels against the night sky, their outlines softened by the haze that always lingered over the Bosphorus. Somewhere far below, the faint echo of a watchman's call reached her ears, a reminder that the palace was not a world apart but a world within a world, both connected to and separate from the life beyond its gates. She thought of the day of the dance in the courtyard, the embroidery by the window, the measured conversation with the valet sultan, the music that had braided itself into the air like smoke. Each moment was a thread in a tapestry too vast for any one woman to see in full, yet each had its place, its weight. Rising, she extinguished the lamp, letting the moonlight claim the room. She lay down on the low bed, the sheets cool against her skin, and closed her eyes. Sleep here was not surrender, but her kind of watchfulness, adrift into the currents beneath the surface of the day. She dreamed of a garden without walls, of a river that did not end, of a voice singing in a language she did not know but somehow understood. In the dream, She walked toward the sound, her bare feet on grass that shimmered like silk, the night air tasting of pomegranate and rain. She woke before dawn, the sky still ink dark, her heart beat steady. Another day waited beyond the threshold, patient and silent, ready to unfold in its own precise order. She would rise soon, wash in the cool water from the brass basin, and dress in the pale light of morning. But for now she lay still, feeling the weight of the palace around her, the slow breathing of the harem's walls, and the quiet truth that here, survival was not only an art, it was the only art worth mastering.